Darius took a step closer to the counter, his calm now threaded with quiet intensity. "So you're refusing to validate this check because— why exactly?" Simmons shrugged, his tone condescending. "These procedures are in place for a reason. It's not personal." But his lingering gaze said otherwise. Darius held his ground. "If it's not personal, then follow standard protocol and verify it. Or are you suggesting I don't belong here?" For a brief moment, something flickered across Simmons' face. Hesitation. Then just as quickly it was gone, replaced by a smirk. "Sir, this bank reserves the right to refuse service if something seems off," Simmons said smoothly. "And frankly, this doesn't look right to me." The murmur of voices grew louder. The tension thickened. Darius took in the scene. The stolen glances, the hushed whispers, the unspoken discomfort on the faces of the other patrons. Yet no one spoke up. "Interesting," Darius murmured, his voice slicing through the noise like a blade. He straightened his jacket, his movements precise, deliberate. "So, you're declining to provide service based on feelings rather than facts?" Simmons' smirk faltered, irritation flashing across his face. "Sir, I don't have to explain myself further. You can take this matter up with another branch if you like." Darius stood there, unmoving. A long, heavy pause stretched between them. Then slowly, he reached for the check still clenched in Simmons' hand. His fingers brushed the paper, his grip firm, yet controlled. "If that's your final decision," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made Simmons stiffen, "I'll handle this another way." And just like that, the power shifted. A low mutter barely reached Darius's ears as he turned away. "Some people really don't know when to quit," Simmons sneered, just loud enough for him to hear. Darius didn't react, not outwardly, but the quiet promise in his gaze said everything. This wasn't over. Stepping to a quieter corner of the bank, he exhaled slowly, his grip on his phone loose yet purposeful. His jaw tensed slightly as he began dialing, his voice steady, measured. Those close enough caught fragments of the conversation. "Yes, at the branch now. Refusing to process. I understand." Across the room, Simmons leaned smugly against the counter, watching Darius with thinly veiled amusement. Turning to the curious customers nearby, he straightened, his voice carrying just enough for them to hear. "We have to be vigilant with fraud these days," he declared, feigning authority. "It's unfortunate, but not everyone comes in here with honest intentions." A woman in line shifted uncomfortably, casting a hesitant glance at Darius. A man near the entrance frowned, but said nothing. Simmons seemed to thrive off their unease, puffing up with self-importance as if their silence validated his actions. But Darius was unfazed. Finishing his call, he walked back to the counter, his posture unwavering. "I've taken the necessary steps to address this," he said, his voice calm yet firm. "I'd advise you to wait before making further assumptions." Simmons barely concealed his disdain, leaning in slightly. "Sir, you're free to address it however you like, but this check isn't going anywhere. I have a duty to protect this institution from potential scams." Darius's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Potential scams? Based on what? My appearance? My profession?" The air in the bank shifted. His words, quiet yet sharp, sliced through the pretense. For the first time, Simmons' smug confidence wavered. It was a flicker, gone in an instant, but Darius saw it. "I don't know what you're implying, sir," Simmons countered, voice loud, playing to the watching crowd. "I'm simply following standard procedures." A faint chuckle escaped Darius. "Your standard procedures don't seem to involve verifying facts, only making baseless assumptions in front of an audience." The room fell into silence. Customers and staff alike strained to catch every word. Simmons straightened, irritation creeping into his features. "Look, I've made my decision," he snapped, adjusting his jacket. "If you'd like to escalate the matter, you're welcome to, but you're wasting your time here." For the first time, a crack appeared in Darius' composed exterior. Just the smallest shift, a hardening of his gaze, a subtle lean forward. "Oh, I'll escalate it, Mr. Simmons," he said, voice low, unwavering. "And trust me, you're going to regret this." Simmons let out a dry scoff, but a flicker of unease crossed his face. "Is that a threat?" he asked, though his tone lacked the confidence it had before. Darius didn't answer. He simply pulled out his phone again, his movements deliberate. While Simmons basked in his false authority, Darius was summoning the real thing. "Some people think they can just walk in here and demand anything they want," Simmons muttered under his breath, ensuring the nearby customers heard. A man walks into a bank expecting a simple transaction, but faces unexpected humiliation. What no one realizes? He owns the bank. What happens next will leave everyone speechless. The air inside Crownstone Bank was thick with prestige, a place where wealth whispered through polished wood and marble halls. But today, prestige would meet its reckoning. When a sharply dressed man walked in to cash a check, he expected routine professionalism. Instead, he was met with suspicion. What the bank manager didn't know was that this wasn't just any customer. This man owned the bank. The soft chime of the entrance bell barely registered as Darius stepped inside, his tailored navy suit crisp, his presence commanding yet unassuming. The scent of leather and fresh ink mingled in the air, underscored by the quiet murmurs of financial dealings echoing off the high ceilings. In his hand, he held a sizable check, his expression unreadable, his patience unwavering as the line inched forward. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the well-heeled clientele, seated comfortably in plush chairs, their presence an unspoken affirmation of exclusivity. This was a place where status was assumed, not questioned. Yet as Darius reached the counter and handed over his check, the young teller hesitated. Her eyes flicked to the amount, widening briefly before she masked her reaction. "I'll need to call my manager to approve this, sir," she said, her voice carefully polite. Darius simply nodded, offering a calm, reassuring smile. "Of course. Take your time." Moments later, a man in his mid-50s strode over, salt and pepper hair, an expensive suit tailored for authority. Mr. Simmons, the bank manager, barely spared Darius a glance as he took the check. His eyes flickered with something unspoken, a brief hesitation, a subtle narrowing. "Excuse me, sir," Simmons said, his tone low, measured. "Do you have any ID to go with this check?" Without missing a beat, Darius retrieved his driver's license and slid it across the counter. Simmons barely looked at it before handing it back, his expression tightening. "I see," he said coolly. "Well, I'll need to verify this with the issuing party." And then it happened. A shift in the air, subtle but unmistakable. A skepticism that had nothing to do with protocol. It was something else. Something personal. Darius met his gaze, his voice unwavering. "Is there an issue?" Simmons hesitated. Then his lips pressed into a thin line. The moment of truth had arrived. The moment stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. Simmons hesitated, his lips parting as if to say more. Then, without another word, he turned sharply and strode toward his office. The air in the room seemed to constrict as Darius remained at the counter, unmoving. His posture remained poised, his expression unreadable. Yet the quiet pressure of the moment rippled through the bank. Minutes passed. Around him, the world continued. Tellers processed transactions. Customers whispered among themselves, their curious glances flickering toward the man still standing at the counter. The weight of uncertainty hung in the air. Then Simmons returned, the check gripped tightly in his hand, his face unreadable. He stopped just short of the counter, his voice clipped and deliberate. "I've looked into this. Mr. Darius, is it?" Simmons purposely omitted his last name, as if it held no significance. "This check raises some red flags. Can you tell me where you got it?" Darius tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes cool and assessing. "It was issued to me as payment for a business transaction. Everything is in order, I assure you." Simmons' lips pressed into a thin, skeptical line. "A business transaction, you say?" He leaned in slightly, voice quieter, but edged with suspicion. "And what business are you in?" For a moment, the room seemed to shrink around them. Darius didn't waver. "Real estate development," he replied smoothly. Simmons let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Real estate, huh? Must be quite a deal to warrant a check like this." He lifted the paper slightly, the movement drawing more eyes. His tone sharpened. "Look, these things don't just fall out of the sky. I'm going to have to decline this transaction." The words landed like a slap. "You haven't verified anything yet," Darius said, his voice still steady, but now edged with irritation. "The issuing party's contact information is right there. Call them." Simmons barely spared the check another glance before waving a dismissive hand. "I don't need to waste my time chasing down details for something that's obviously suspicious." His voice rose slightly, enough for others to hear. "If you want, you can try cashing this somewhere else." The bank's atmosphere shifted. A woman near the entrance looked up, eyes darting between the two men. A teller whispered to a coworker, their stolen glances betraying nervousness. A few chuckled nervously, while others shifted, uncertain. The tension was suffocating. Darius, however, remained a pillar of quiet resolve, unshaken, unbothered. Then, the sound of heavy footsteps shattered the uneasy silence. A group of sharply dressed individuals entered the bank, their presence commanding immediate attention. Conversations died. Heads turned. Leading them was a tall woman in a sleek blazer, exuding authority with every step. Her sharp eyes swept the room, locking onto Darius instantly. "Mr. Charles," she said, her tone warm, professional, and most importantly, respectful. "I came as soon as I got your call." The air thickened. A stunned silence fell over the bank. Simmons' face paled, the confidence drained from his posture, his authority crumbling in real time. Because now he understood. And just like that, the balance of power shifted. The sharp click of heels against polished marble sliced through the stunned silence. A tall woman in a sleek blazer strode forward, exuding an air of unshakable authority. Behind her, two other executives followed, their tailored suits and unreadable expressions making it clear. This wasn't a casual visit. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Darius remained composed, extending a hand in greeting. "Thank you for coming so quickly," he said, his voice steady, deliberate. "Of course," she replied, shaking his hand firmly before turning to Simmons. In an instant, her professional warmth vanished, replaced by a gaze cold enough to freeze the room. "I assume you're Mr. Simmons, the manager of this branch?" Simmons swallowed hard. He fumbled for words, desperately clinging to the last remnants of his authority. Yes, that's me. May I ask what this is about?" His voice wavered. The woman didn't blink. Instead, she lifted the check, his check, the very one Simmons had refused to process. "This," she said icily, "is a matter of grave concern." She turned slightly, gesturing toward Darius. "Mr. Charles here is one of our most valued partners. When he informed us of the treatment he received at your hands, I was appalled." Simmons' mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his confidence draining by the second. "Valued partner?" he echoed weakly, his face paling. The woman's eyes narrowed. "Not just a partner. Mr. Charles is the majority shareholder in this institution." The word struck like a thunderclap. Gas rippled through the bank lobby. A man near the window dropped the magazine he'd been flipping through, his head snapping up in disbelief. The young teller who had initially assisted Darius covered her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Darius said nothing. He simply stood there, his silence carrying more power than any raised voice ever could. Simmons, however, was unraveling. "Wait, there must be some mistake," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know." "You didn't know," Darius interrupted, his tone sharp but controlled, "because you didn't bother to find out. The moment I walked in, you made a snap judgment. Instead of verifying the facts, you chose to humiliate me, publicly." The woman turned back to Simmons, her expression unwavering. "Your behavior today was not just unprofessional, it was unacceptable. This institution prides itself on integrity and respect for all clients, regardless of how they look, where they come from, or what assumptions you might make about them." Simmons' throat bobbed as he struggled to form words. Sweat gathered at his temples. I can explain," he stuttered. Darius raised a hand, the simplest of gestures, but it silenced him instantly. "There's no need," Darius said, his voice cool, composed. "Your actions spoke louder than any explanation ever could. You judged me before you knew anything about me, and in doing so, you made it painfully clear to everyone here what you truly believe." The bank was deathly silent. Every single person, customers, tellers, security, was watching Simmons, who now looked as if he wished the ground would swallow him whole. And then Darius turned, not to Simmons, but to the gathered crowd. There was no anger in his expression, no arrogance, only conviction. And when he spoke next, his words carried the weight of something far greater than just personal vindication. The heavy silence in the bank lingered, pressing down on everyone like an unseen weight. Conversations that had once filled the room with idle chatter had faded into nothingness, leaving only the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the distant tapping of a teller's keyboard. Simmons stood frozen behind the counter, his face drained of color. The check trembled slightly in his grasp as he slowly set it down, as if touching it any longer would burn him. His mind raced, but there was no escape, no smooth recovery, no charming words to undo the damage. He had misjudged not just a man, but a force far greater than himself. Across the room, customers exchanged glance. Some looked ashamed, their earlier quiet approval of Simmons' actions now weighing on them. Others appeared thoughtful, as if seeing the world through a new lens. The young woman near the entrance, the one who had nodded along with Darius' speech, now watched Simmons with a gaze that carried something close to pity. The executive woman cleared her throat, snapping the room back to attention. She turned to one of her associates, her voice crisp, professional. "I want a full report on this incident by the end of the day. Make sure it's sent directly to corporate." The associate nodded and pulled out a tablet, already beginning to type. "As for you, Mr. Simmons," she continued, her tone now carrying an undeniable finality, "you will be placed on immediate suspension while we review your actions." Simmons finally found his voice, weak as it was. "Suspension?" he croaked. The woman's gaze was unwavering. "Given the gravity of your conduct today, I wouldn't be surprised if it's permanent." A hushed murmur rippled through the crowd. A few customers exchanged knowing looks, some barely suppressing their satisfaction. Simmons had strutted around this bank for years, his smugness grating on more than just Darius. Now, the same arrogance that had once made him untouchable had left him utterly exposed. Simmons inhaled sharply, as if about to argue, but then his shoulders slumped. He knew, they all knew, there was no coming back from this. The weight of change. The young teller still clutched Darius' business card in her hands, her fingers running over the embossed letters. She swallowed hard before looking up at the executive woman. I just wanted to say that—" She hesitated, glancing at Simmons before steeling herself. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened. Not just to Mr. Charles, but to others. Customers, even staff." A fresh wave of murmurs swept through the room. The executive woman studied her carefully. "Go on." The teller took a breath, then stood a little taller. She gestured toward Simmons, "has a way of treating certain people differently. Maybe not always this obvious, but you can feel it." Simmons stiffened, his lips pressing into a thin line. The executive woman's expression darkened. "Thank you for speaking up." She turned to the other executives. "We'll be conducting a thorough internal review. Staff, customer complaints, everything." Her associate nodded, making another note. The weight in the room shifted. It wasn't just about Simmons anymore. It never had been. Darius had set something in motion, a reckoning, a final word. Outside the bank, the sun cast long shadows across the pavement. Darius stood for a moment, inhaling deeply, feeling the crisp air fill his lungs. The world hadn't changed in an instant. It never did. But today, something had cracked. A system, a pattern, a belief that had gone unchecked for too long. As he stepped forward, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the name flashing across the screen. Smiling slightly, he answered. "It's handled," he said simply. And with that, he walked away, leaving behind not just a bank, but a lesson that no one inside would soon forget. Inside the bank, the atmosphere remained charged with reflection. Conversations buzzed in hushed tones, not with idle gossip, but with the weight of what had transpired. Something had shifted. The executive woman turned back to the customers and staff, her voice clear and unwavering. "Let this be a lesson for everyone here today. Our institution was built on trust, equality, and fairness. If we fail to uphold those principles, we fail the very people we are here to serve. This isn't just about a single incident. It's about accountability, about striving to do better." Several customers nodded, some looking visibly moved. A few employees exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of guilt and realization. The young teller, still clutching Darius' business card, discreetly wiped at her eyes. As the executives exited the branch, murmurs spread through the crowd. An older gentleman in a tweed jacket leaned toward the woman beside him, speaking softly. "He didn't just teach Simmons a lesson," he said, shaking his head. "He taught all of us something today." Beyond the bank outside, Darius stood on the sidewalk, the pulse of the city moving around him. Life carried on. The honk of distant traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, the rhythmic footsteps of people with places to be. It was a reminder that the world wouldn't stop for moments like these. But that didn't mean they didn't matter. He looked up at the bank for a moment, a faint smile playing at his lips, not of triumph, but of quiet satisfaction. The work wasn't done, but a step had been taken. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to find a text from the executive woman. "All actions have been set in motion. Thank you for your patience and for giving us the opportunity to